looked up, squinting through the dusty haze. There, right by the wooden post, stood a skinny Apache girl. Her hair was a tangled mess, her bare feet caked in mud, and her eyes were filled with both hunger and fear. Without saying a word, she just clutched her empty belly. Her lips cracked and dry. Reed stopped what he was doing. He did not ask her name. He simply opened the gate and motioned for her to come in. The girl hesitated, but the smell of fresh cornbread drifting from the cabin lit up her eyes. In the kitchen, Reed placed a hot piece of cornbread and a cup of goat's milk on the table. The girl sat down, still weary. But the moment her fingers touched the food, she devoured it like she had not tasted anything like it in a long time. Elias brought over an old wool blanket and laid it near the fireplace. No one said a word. Only the crackle of the fire and the sound of hurried chewing filled the room. Reed sat in the corner holding his pipe, his eyes occasionally drifting toward the child. Once her stomach was full, she wrapped the blanket around her shoulders, gave Reed a small nod, a silent thank you, and then quietly stepped outside, disappearing into the dusk painted with red dust. Reed remained seated, staring into the fire, overcome by a strange feeling. It had been far too long since this cabin last felt the footsteps of a child. 3 days had passed since Reed gave the Apache girl something to eat. He thought he would never see her again. But on the afternoon of the 4th day, just as the sun was turning a deep red and beginning to sink behind the hills, Reed spotted a familiar figure hovering near the fence. T had returned. Her hair was still tangled, her eyes still cautious, but this time she was not alone. Beside her stood a tall woman, face hollow, shoulders bare and marked with old whip scars, her left arm loosely wrapped in a dirty, blood-stained cloth. Her steps were uneven, but her dark eyes burned with fierce alertness. Reed sat down the water bucket he had been pulling up and stood still on the porch. The woman stopped about 30 feet away, pushed her daughter behind her, then spoke in a hoarse voice drained by exhaustion, "We have nowhere else to go. I can do anything. Haul water, cook, tend livestock, clear land. I just ask you to let us stay for the night, even just under the porch." Reed stared at them for a long moment without saying a word. The old dog growled softly, then fell silent. A gust of wind swept red dust across the field, rattling the weathered wooden fence. He remembered the girl eating cornbread days ago, her cracked lips, that awkward little nod. Now she stood behind her mother, gripping the hem of a torn shirt, her eyes still full of fear, but this time with a flicker of hope. Reed sighed. He was not a kind man, nor someone who liked to get involved in other people's troubles. But in that moment, the emptiness of his cabin echoed with a familiar voice. "Do not turn your back on those in need." It was something his wife used to say many years ago back when she was still alive. He nodded and slowly opened the gate. "Come in." Without another word, Reed turned and walked into the kitchen, stirring the fire back to life. When the mother and daughter stepped inside, he pulled out an old wooden chair and set the last loaf of cornbread and a pot of beans on the table. Then he glanced toward the corner of the room where a thick blanket was folded. "Sleep there," Reed said plainly. May bowed her head, her voice trembling. "Thank you, sir." Lahi sat down right away, clutching the warm bowl of beans, her tense face slowly beginning to relax. Reed sat across the room, eyes on the fire, asking no questions. He understood sometimes. Silence is the kindest thing you can offer. That first night, the little cabin was so quiet you could hear every crack and pop from the firewood burning in the stove. Reed lay on his old wooden bed, his back turned toward the mother and daughter curled up on the blanket laid out on the floor. He was used to being alone. But tonight, the sound of someone else breathing in the same room stirred something in him. It was not discomfort, just unfamiliar. The next morning, when Reed went out to draw water from the well, May was already up. She limped along with another bucket, her shoulders trembling from the pain, but her face was set with determination. "Let me do it," she said firmly, as if she had to prove her worth. Reed said nothing. He simply took the bucket from her and set it down beside the well in the cattle shed. As Reed was tying the hay rack back together, he noticed T trotting in after him. The little girl placed a handful of hay in front of a calf, her eyes lighting up with delight. Reed paused for a second, looked at her, then gave a quiet nod. He did not smile, but the coldness in his gaze softened just a bit. By noon, when Elias returned from the fields, he saw the porch had been swept clean and his torn shirts had been patched with rough thread. Awanadada sat leaning against a post, her left arm still hurting, but her eyes were brighter, like someone who had found a sliver of purpose after running for too long. Reed paused on the steps, caught off guard. It had been years since anyone touched his things, and now someone was quietly tending to them. That evening, dinner was a quiet affair. Awanada had seasoned the pot of beans with a few herbs she carried in a cloth pouch. Reed took a bite. A gentle warmth spreading across his tongue. He said nothing, just kept eating. But there was a subtle shift in his expression. Something gentler flickered in his eyes. T sat beside her mother and let out a soft giggle the first time Reed had heard her laugh. It was faint, childlike, and he realized it had been far too long since he had heard a sound like that. The next day, while Reed was out repairing the fence, he saw Awanadada moving slowly on a crutch, gathering dry grass. Her injury still pained her, but she did not stop. She worked steadily, never leaving the job half. Reed walked over, took the bundle from her shoulder, and placed it onto the cart. They looked at each other. Not a word exchanged, just a quiet understanding. 3 days had passed. The cabin, once so used to silence, now held the sounds of footsteps, well water being drawn, and spoons clinking against pots. It was not a family, not yet something close, but it was no longer a place for just one man. Reed still kept his distance, but he knew something was beginning to change. Slowly, wordlessly, the morning sky was clear, and sunlight spread across the prairie like a golden carpet. Reed Callahan carried his hammer out to the northern fence where the old wooden posts had long since collapsed. He was used to working alone, but this time 2 figures followed behind him. Anata, her shoulder wrapped in a strip of rough cloth to cover the wound, rolled up her sleeves and lifted a heavy log as if she felt no pain at all. The muscles in her shoulders flexed. Her sun-worn hands gripped the wood tightly, and she placed it cleanly into position. Reed frowned slightly, not in disapproval, but in surprise. He had not expected a woman to have that kind of strength and resolve. T was not one to stand still either. The little girl carried small bundles of straw, helping gather dry grass for the cattle shed. A flock of curious chickens followed her around, making her laugh out loud. The sound echoed through the open yard, a sound Reed had not heard since the day he lost his family. By midday, the 3 of them sat beneath the shade of the old oak tree. Reed passed the water jug to Awanada. She took a sip and something in her eyes softened. T, sitting in the middle, opened a cloth pouch and shared what was left of some roasted corn, offering a handful to Reed. He accepted it slowly and gave a nod in place of thanks. That afternoon, they worked together to repair the roof of the horse shelter. Awanada climbed up, hammering wooden slats into place. Sweat soaking the back of her shirt. Reed held the ladder steady below, occasionally glancing up, but his gaze was no longer filled with doubt. It had become something closer to quiet respect. T, barefoot and dusty, stood nearby, handing them nails and tools, small, but eager to help in any way she could. By dusk, dinner felt different. Instead of silence, Awanada asked Reed a few short questions about the land, the crops. He answered gruffly, but his tone had lost its chill. T jumped in, talking about the newborn calf, making both of them laugh. That night, Reed sat on the front porch, lighting his pipe, and looking out over the yard, now tidier after a day of shared work. Inside the cabin, Awanada was folding her daughter's blanket, her movements firm, but gentle. Reed took a long drag from his pipe and exhaled slowly. Inside him, something had begun to flicker, a warmth he thought had long since left him. It was not quite family, but this cabin no longer felt empty. I truly appreciate having you here. And if this story stirred up a memory maybe of dusty evenings and the sound of hooves echoing in your heart, then be sure to subscribe to my channel so that each day we can sit together again and I will tell you another story from the West. That night, the wind howled through the cracks in the door, blowing ashes in slow circles around the fire. Reed sat at the table, whittling a small piece of wood into a fishing lure with his pocket knife. Awanada sat across from him, stitching a torn shirt with coarse thread,